Today, women make up half of the U.S. workforce, control over half of the country's wealth, and vote at higher rates than men. And despite their economic and civic contributions, they hold few spots at the top echelons of companies and government. And the case for women in leadership extends beyond ethics. It's an absolutely economic imperative. You know, when CED was approached several years ago to take on the issue of women on corporate boards, and we ultimately released our policy study around the Every Other One campaign, basically asking companies to fill every other open board seat with a woman. When that idea came to our membership, we had very few women on our board. And I look at Paula Stern, one of our longstanding CED members, and Paula will remember when she was one of the few women who were members of CED. And when this panel, right before this panel started, Carolyn Chin, a former member, came to me and talked about CED's diversity and how it's increased over the years, and she really paid tribute to that fact. And I don't think any of that would have happened if it wasn't for leadership at the top. It was Steve Odland, it was Maggie Wilderotter, and I see Carl Camden right next to me. Men and women at CED who committed themselves to diversifying. And I would argue we are a much better organization. It's not just diversity, gender diversity, it's diversity of color, it's diversity of thought, and we're a stronger organization because of that. So here to weigh in on this expert panel is Patricia Davis-Muffett, Senior Executive at Amazon Web Services, as the moderator. And I'll quickly just introduce our panelists, and then we can go into this discussion. Kathleen Abernathy is the Executive Vice President of External Affairs at Frontier Communications. She also has government experience. Carl Camden, of course, is the President and CEO of Kelly Services. Julianna Richter, the Chief Operating Officer of Edelman's U.S. division. And of course, Jane Stevenson, one of our members as well, the global leader of CEO Succession and Vice Chairman of the Board and CEO Services at Korn Ferry. So Patricia and panelists, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be here today. So I'm Patricia Davis-Muffett. I'm one of the leaders of the global public sector team at Amazon Web Services here based in DC. Obviously, we're a global company, but we do base our business focused on government, education, and nonprofits globally here in the DC area. So I'm very pleased to be here today and talking about the glass ceiling, and I think we have an interesting opportunity to talk about this at this particular moment. So let me just take a moment to have each of the panelists introduce themselves and their background to you.
Sure, thank you. I'm Julianna Richter. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Edelman here in the United States. For anyone who's not familiar with Edelman, we're the largest public relations and communications marketing firm in the world. In the US, we have about 3,000 employees, and I'm very proud to say the vast majority of those are women. So happy to talk about this topic today.
Kathleen Abernathy. I am the Executive Vice President of External Affairs for Frontier Communications. Was brought to that company after being an FCC commissioner by Maggie Wilderotter, who was a terrific mentor and just a terrific leader. I've learned from her over the years, and she did an amazing job bringing in very talented women to the company and then promoting us for opportunities on boards. So I greatly appreciate the importance of having a mentor.
Jane Stevenson, Vice Chairman of Board and CEO Services at Korn Ferry, where I get involved with this issue in two ways. One is leading our global CEO succession practice, where I get a chance to actually look at not only immediate succession candidates, but in the leadership development and assessment of second and third generation candidates, and the opportunity to include more women in those roles, which we'll get into later. And secondly, around board governance and the structure of boards and the involvement of diversity on all levels, but certainly gender diversity and the ways that gender diversity actually adds financial value to organizations.
I'm Carl Camden, CEO of Kelly. I joined Kelly 21 years ago, but before that was a tenured college professor and department chair who was lured away from university into corporate America by a colleague at Korn Ferry, by the way. And it all turned out okay. I am proud to say that at Kelly, beginning with our branch managers all the way up to our board of directors, 50% of our leadership team from the board down to the branch management team are women, and I'm happy to talk about that experience and the path that we had along the way.
Great. So, Jane, why don't we start out with you? I think you have a unique view of the private sector landscape and what things look like for women in leadership now. So I'd love to get your perspective on what you're seeing in the private sector and what the outlook is for women in C-level positions.
Well, I think there are so many things that could be said about that. I think that we've seen a recognition and a kind of a commitment to outcomes for a long time now, with a huge gap between the actual commitment and the tactics to get it done. I'm really pleased to say that I'm seeing a real yearning on many fronts to actually close that gap with things that can really work. I think that is happening in a lot of different ways. I think that the recent data from the Peterson report and others that really strongly conveys, and if you haven't looked at it, you should, but that makes it clear that having gender diversity in top leadership roles does make a difference in terms of financial performance. So I think that's starting to shift the landscape. There are a lot of endeavors, not the least of which is CEDs, where I'm proud to be co-chair of the Women's Economic Contribution Committee with two other great leaders, and our Every Other One initiative is starting to create commitments around action. Rockefeller has a really dynamic engagement around 100 by 25, looking at getting 100 of the Fortune 500 CEOs to be women by 2025, thus 100 by 25. I know at Korn Ferry we're doing a lot of work around looking at what, not only what do we want to happen, but how do we get it to happen. And there's a really interesting dynamic at play when you look at business unit leadership and some of the competencies that are the best competencies that correlate to performance in major P&L and top leadership roles. And at that level, women outperform their male counterparts by aptitude on about 7 different competencies. That said, if they don't have the experiences to actually close that gap, that remains a capability that's untapped by organizations. So what we're seeing is organizations starting to actually ask the question, how can we make that happen? So I'll just pause there, but
yeah.
A lot of movement, a lot of the right questions. I think actions always speak louder than words, and we're starting to see some actions.
Yeah. So Kathleen, I'd love to get your perspective, since you've been a leader in the public sector, and certainly my experience in the public sector is, we see more women technology leaders in the public sector than on the private sector side. At our last public sector summit for AWS, we had all women in our keynote, so all CIOs from various public sector. But I'd love to hear your experience on how you think women are faring as leaders in the public sector.
I think the public sector offers amazing opportunities for women, and I have to admit that I would not be where I am today but for the opportunity I had in the public sector. And when I first came to DC and started working in telecommunications in law firms and quickly realized I wanted to do public policy, I appreciated that I was never going to break through at the most senior levels at the companies where I wanted to work unless I went into government first and created a name for myself, a reputation. And the government has tremendous opportunities for women in so many ways. And as a result of that, all of a sudden, I was able to go into government, come back out, work in the private sector for some a number of different companies and then go back into the government again as a commissioner and come back out to work in a company. And the skills you develop having both that public and those corporate experiences are incredibly valuable. And I know some people fault going in and out of government. I think I was a better regulator because I understood how companies think. And I was better at my company for explaining why government will regulate you, whether you like it or not, and how you work in that space in a way that can be mutually beneficial. So I now look at the change in administration, which I know there's a number of people who aren't too happy, but when I look at opportunities for women, I will say this. There are a number of incredibly talented women who will be coming out of government, and there are a number of incredibly talented women who will be recruited into government. And that just fills the pipeline that Korn Ferry and others will be looking at. And that overall, I think, will be good for women, because I've worked in both Republican and Democratic administrations, and in every instance, the number of women in government are much higher than what you would see in the private sector.
I wonder if I could just chime in for a minute, because I think what you just demonstrated is an example of what I'm talking about. And that is, you took a career turn to set yourself up to have different opportunities, and that isn't something that happens in a minute. It happens over multiple years. And so I just wanted to make the point that what we're talking about when people are moving to action from just semantics is something that takes, a long time. It takes 10 years on average to really build a CEO. So the plans that we have as organizations have to really take into account the exact kind of career changes that Kathleen really demonstrated.
Yeah, for sure. And so, Carl, I'm very interested to hear how it is that you've achieved sounds like you've taken great action in your organization, or that there's been great action there to bring gender diversity to the table. So I'd love to hear about what you've done within Kelly Services and how you as a male leader have encouraged that.
Thank you. I think the challenge is for us to learn how to develop our companies in a way that it takes no great actions or interventions for this to occur. And that was my orientation from the beginning, because it should have been easy at Kelly, because the fields that we draw from for our new officer corps are the disciplines are communication, psychology, sociology, HR, and those are all disciplines that have a great quantity of superb female students who are graduating with those degrees. So our feeder program was established, and I decided early on my job as an officer at Kelly and all the way up to the CEO was to figure out how to get the company out of the way of allowing the talent to rise up into the position, rather than trying to stage a series of interventions to bring in talent from the outside. And what I'm most proud of is of my 12 senior officers, from whom the next CEO will come, is that the 6 women in that group have all been at Kelly 15 to 20 years.
Wow.
They came up through the system. And while a portion of them are lead staff officers, chief marketing, chief HR, of my 3 business segments, 2 of those are led by women. All of which tells me that after I leave the company, the next generation of C-level leadership in that company is going to be at least 50% women. It's going to sustain. And so the question for me then is, what were the disconnects? And the disconnects along the way were we were making it difficult for women to leave the workforce and then to come back into the workforce without having their career disrupted. As a company that prizes flexible labor, we were surprisingly inflexible as I was looking at our policies for how people could exit and re-enter. And we dealt with a lot of those issues. And then I looked at, instead of looking at the very top of the company and doing the count, I wanted to know if I started out with 50% here, how come it got to 40% here?
Yeah.
And I turned my systems engineers into, go tell me why. I went from 50 to 40. That's what I need to know, because that's where the breakdown begins to occur, and that's what causes companies to have to stage interventions later.
Yeah. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that early pipeline of talent and leadership. So Juliana, what does it look like at Edelman when you're recruiting new leaders into the organization?
So I think similar to what Carl was saying, we've been very fortunate because the intervention that you talked about came from our CEO, Richard Edelman, who's a father of 3 daughters, and I'm sure that played a part deliberately, stated in 2001, we want to make sure we have 50% of our leadership is women, and put an actual measurable goal on the table for his leadership team and others. So when we think about recruitment, when we think about people we're bringing into the organization or rising up throughout the ranks of the organization, it really is coming from the top. And I think that's helping keep it very focused and making sure that everyone is conscious about it. And when I think about some of the companies that we work with as our clients, that's a distinction I make. There's sometimes always a desire for more diversity, whether it's gender or any other diversity. It's got to be conscious, it's got to be talked about, it's got to be considered, measured, all of those things. And we take that very seriously. So when we look at who we're recruiting in, we're not quite at the stage of a balanced scorecard yet. I don't know if we ever will be, but we have no problem saying that doesn't look like a good group of people, a diverse mix. Let's go back out and find out who else is out there. And always, it goes without saying, probably the person has to earn that job, but we're much more conscious about having those discussions.
So it really comes down to the pool of talent that you're looking at?
I just wanted to add,
Sure.
based on what Juliana said, is what I have seen, which just shows I've been around way too long, is that people get too comfortable with people like them, whether you're a man or a woman or of one race or another. And you have to, and that's the beauty of saying we're going to do 50% or we're going to make a certain achievement. You have to be willing to say to yourself, I shouldn't surround myself with people exactly like me, because all of us will lean in that direction if we're not careful. And I've seen that too many times where you make headway in a company. Maybe there's a leadership change, and it'll sort of move back a little if people aren't consciously thinking, I have got to have diversity, because you look for people that look, think, and act like you, and that, I think all the studies show, that's not good for your company. You're not going to get the best results when everybody looks and thinks like you do.
Yeah. I'm interested if any of you have unique recruiting techniques that you're using, not necessarily just for diversity, but to expand that pool so it's not just people people who are like you. At Amazon, we have a pretty unique recruiting philosophy, and we have people on every interview loop who have no vested interest in actually filling the position. Their only role is to make sure that the person who's hired is better than half of the people who are in that kind of role across the company. That does push you to go beyond people you might like or know or who've worked with before, but does anybody have an interesting way of building a talent pipeline in their organization?
Sure. Yeah, I think, again, because I tend to focus at the very bottom of the of the pool to make certain it's fed, I look to make certain that we're not always recruiting from the same colleges or universities. Speaking of diversity, I wanted to know, why weren't we drawing more people out of the traditionally African American universities? And we weren't. When I paid attention to that, we were drawing insufficient numbers. Why weren't we drawing the same number of Hispanics out of the southwestern universities? And so it's a constant challenging of yourself as to what are you missing. And all along the way, I'm proud to say that I had a team that was willing to point out where I was being stupid and things that I was missing.
Always useful.
That's always. No, I tell my team when I ask the mid-management, who ask what does it take to get promoted into senior management, I say, win an argument with me. Prove me I'm wrong. Show me something I'm doing wrong and you're golden. And I think it's critical because we get comfortable with our success and then we miss our failures because we're kind of reveling in, look how cool we are.
Yeah.
Look what we've done.
I would just add something that we started maybe about a year and a half ago mindfully. was not just looking for leadership roles for individuals, women, and again, people from different backgrounds, but leadership opportunities. And that's been very successful for us, not only, I think, for bringing in new talent, but retaining really good talent, because frankly, not everyone can necessarily or wants to be able to take on a new role. But when you start to really break it down in terms of an opportunity, and that could be someone sitting on a working group or a task force or leading an initiative that the company needs to have happen and no one else is doing it, that changes the dialogue immediately, and that gives an opportunity to someone to get those skill sets that they might not have. So we did that by accident, to be honest with you, and started to realize, okay, this is helpful. How do we now formalize that?
Jane, I'm interested in when you're looking at talent for future CEOs. Do you look at those kind of things, those project-based opportunities people have really taken advantage of to show themselves to be leaders at the next level?
Well, I think that yes, but I think the big gap that we find is lack of P&L leadership experience. So I really like what Carl said in terms of creating options. It's very unlikely that you'll have a female CEO if in your leadership succession pipeline the first 2 generations of candidates are all male. So one of the things that we find happens is that there's this huge misnomer, and it's across a very broad range. Who knows exactly how this starts, but that somehow if a woman is in a functional line of increased responsibility, that there's more flexibility to raise a family, et cetera. As if when there's a crisis, the CEO will somehow let you take your kids trick-or-treating if you're the CMO, right? Or the CHRO. So it's really is a misnomer, and I think one of the things that we have to do is to help women to understand that running a business is a core capability and that they bring very unique skills, particularly around empowering other people, around inclusion, around actually execution,
right,
which is a core competency that women bring. And the other piece is that we kind of have to surround the issue. And so we definitely need to start early. I think Carl and my other colleagues have made good comments there, but we also have to have representation in ways that we very seldom, as any human being, regardless of gender or diversity, achieve something that we don't see as possible. And so without women on our boards and without women in top leadership roles, as role models that are personal and able to be related to as an individual, it's going to be really hard to do everything that's possible. So I think we have to go above, below, and beside.
Since some of my board members might at some point listen to this, I should note that with half of my board as women in particular, they've been aggressive at making certain that all of that top group of candidates are mentored, and in particular, my women board members have been exceptional at making certain that they've embraced the female leadership team so that they don't get lost or forgotten in the cycle. And it's hard in a global company, because one of my top officers, she's running Europe and APAC, and that means she's not really at the headquarters very often, and I've watched my board take particular care to see that she gets that attention.
Well, and that was the other thing I was going to add at Frontier. We have mentors. When I was on the board first, and then came in-house when we started doing a bunch of transactions. So I actually mentored senior leaders when I was on the board, and then once I came in-house, had a relationship with the board chair as a mentor to me. So I think that's a great framework for building up talent. And then the other thing that I didn't do early enough in my career to really help people that were coming up behind me that I should have done, help women, minorities, even men, is I didn't take when they made a mistake, I kind of engage and say, you did this wrong, go do this. I didn't take the time to really sit down and say, let me tell you why that was the wrong way to handle it, and why if you do that over and over, it's not going to work for you as you want to build up your profession. And I think at our company we need to have a more structured program so that just knowing you did something wrong isn't helpful unless you know why, if you'd done it this way, it's a better way to do it.
Right.
The other thing that I think is really important that we've learned in doing a fair amount of research around, what can change the game and what makes the difference. And what we found is, on average, men are more attracted to labels than women. And so women are more attracted to areas of mission and contribution. So just on average.
Don't you just hate being stereotyped?
So what does that mean? So the odds of a woman saying, I want to be the CEO as a primary aspiration versus a man saying that out loud, I'm not talking about ambition, I'm not talking about motivation, I'm not suggesting that men don't want to do great things. I'm just saying that the research shows that what men say they want to accomplish and what women say they want to accomplish is, on average, very different. And so if boards are looking for someone to step up and say, I want to be CEO, they're going to be waiting a long time because women are much more likely to say, I want to help the organization accomplish the following. So it's a really important distinction, I think, for boards and leaders to take into account. One of the things that we do is to assess leadership and look at how people are motivated as part of the equation, the motivators and drivers of what puts gas into their engine. And if you look at women and men in terms of the real motivation to do the job and to accomplish what the job enables you to achieve, it's not that different. So if you look at that relative to upper quartile CEOs. So if you take away nothing else, it's not just what people say about the label that goes with it, it's really looking under the surface.
I also think we have to make certain that we're mentoring, that we're asking them to emit the right behaviors. I have people who say, I haven't been into a board meeting in 2 or 3 meetings, get me in there. And then I have other people who, if I don't invite them into a board meeting, they're quite happy. They might never show up. And part of our job is to teach people what it takes in order to be considered as a CEO candidate. Yeah. And so I'm agreeing. I think it's a very critical thing that mentors miss. And so I say, I don't care whether you like talking to the board or not, or whether you perceive it as risky or not. If you've not been there,
right.
This year I've let you down and you've let yourself down by not telling me.
Something that you're describing is something that we took note of as well, which is moving from mentorship to sponsorship. And I think that that's been a big sea change for our company and others, where it's an active sponsor who's saying what Carl's indicating, come in or go, or pushing you or encouraging you, as opposed to mentoring, which can sometimes be a little bit more passive. That's been working quite a bit, especially for the women that we're trying to elevate up.
I was really interested in that idea of mission focus for women, and how women tend to identify with what they want to accomplish. And I wonder if there's part of that is related to more women rising higher in public sector, or there being more women at the moment who are in more senior positions in public sector. I'd love to hear a little bit from you, Kathleen, about, since you did take a very active role in your own transformation and really seeking out the opportunities to go back and forth, about how you identified that and how you went about, making that shift and building the skills you would need for the future.
I haven't thought about it in a while, but essentially what happened is that and I'll be right up front, I didn't have the kinds of academic credentials that I would need to make it to the highest levels. And it's because I didn't know. I grew up in Kentucky. I went to school in Wisconsin. I didn't know that it mattered that much about your academic credentials. I now know, well, guess what? It does. So I had to, once I got to DC and sort of figured out the lay of the land, I had to say, what do I have to do to overcome that? And the way to overcome that is you have to prove what you're capable of. And if companies weren't able to provide that opportunity for me, then government was. And the beauty of the government is that there are continually new opportunities. If you're a hard worker, if you're smart, if you put in your time, it's very likely that you'll be given more and more levels of responsibility, because the churn in the public sector is higher than the churn in the private sector. And then you can build a credibility. And then moving back and forth, all of a sudden, I had experiences, knowledge, relationships that other people couldn't match. So it didn't really matter where I was when I was 21, 22. It mattered where I was when I was 37, 38, 39. So from there, then, I was able to build on it. Now, I tell, because I talk to a lot of women, I'm sure we all do, about what do you do with your career? And I always say, get the best credentials you can, because it saves you time. But on the other hand, I look back at all my experiences and realize it's made me better at what I do regardless of where I would have gone to school. So I am a firm believer that when you want to contribute, whether it's in the public sector or the private sector, everything builds on itself and makes you a better, more valued colleague in the private sector or on boards. I'm on a board because I'm fortunate that I'm in a company where I'm allowed to be on a board. And a lot of companies won't let you do that.
Yeah.
So that combination of skills is the way I looked at it. And I think you can do that if you're in a big company moving from division to division. But that matters, that sort of thinking, where do I want to go and how do I get there?
I think one of the challenges for us as we all collectively deal with education as well as with mentoring and leadership is recognizing that here in the United States, a third of the people don't work as employees. They're bright, talented, sharp people who are 1099s, SEPs, my temps, or other folks, and we deploy 1 million of those people. And so the question is, we're going to groom them to be industry leaders, business leaders, and future CEOs. What do we do? Because the traditional advice we give doesn't work. And so one of the ideas we've been playing with at Kelly is, how do we, and sparked by what you're saying here, is how do we build a portfolio of experience? Instead of recommending to them that you work 5 years in this, and then you do this, and you sit on this committee, and you work in this charity, we've got to get collectively our heads around the fact there's a lot of people who don't work in that mode where that happens. And how do we mentor people to build the portfolio of experiences that invites them into business leadership or public sector leadership and so on, as opposed to the traditional path that we all, or at least I think most of us, grew up in, but isn't going to be the path that our children are
Yeah.
going to grow up in.
Well, and I think the current technology environment also lends itself to that. So certainly our experience at Amazon Web Services is that the access to technology and to the technology resources to implement your idea, create a startup, start a new nonprofit and reach out, or create a startup within an organization allows somebody who's really bright and motivated to demonstrate their skills and abilities in that way. Maybe they're not somebody who is comfortable asking to go into a board meeting in a large organization, but they are comfortable, doing a proof of concept for a new business line and demonstrating what that could be, right? So I think recognizing that that can be a way that people speak up about their abilities and their, wanting to have greater responsibility is also a little bit on us as leaders to see that as raising their hand, right?
I think there's a counterintuitive element to this in that, we have conversations about this very much in the context of ambition and outcomes of individuals. And the reality is that from a leadership development standpoint, the most impactful mechanism is the business strategy itself. And so one of the things that I'm going to assume, we haven't talked about it, Carl, but is that there's a clarity around outcomes in your organization that your leadership team understands. And so then people start to harness what they can contribute to create options of leadership that actually enhance the odds that you're going to achieve business success. And that sounds so simple, and yet it is seldom done well. So when you really, as a board, are able to clarify, if we think in terms of the next 5+ years, these are the 3 to 5 things that are going to indicate we've achieved success, and that the leadership team, not just at the top level, but a few levels down below that, really understand how do I fit into that and what can I bring to that. That is so empowering, and it creates opportunities for people to play full out and to really develop the experiences around their competencies against a business objective, so that people are still working together, and it's out of this sort of competitive zone that says, I win, you lose. Maybe something we might port to Washington, but
And
Just
the
an
rock
idea.
stars in that process are the ones who know the clarity
exactly.
and are willing to totally toss out the business plan when it is screwed up and not working,
Yeah.
and punch and go right at it a different way and not ask me for permission, not wait for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks for the corporate hierarchy,
Right.
but they rock and roll it.
Right.
And I'm not going to punish them ever for failing if
Yeah.
they do that. As long as it was a bright thought, then let them
Yeah.
go.
Well, and I think that gets back to Kathleen's thought on talking to people about their failures, right? I mean, one of the things that my boss has always said to me is, this is a very safe place to fail, but don't fail the same way twice, right? So,
Ratio matters too, right?
right. Julianna, I wanted to ask you a little bit because your industry is traditionally quite female dominated, and I'm wondering whether inclusion looks a little bit different there. I remember a story that a friend of mine told me who had been in D.C. and he'd been in lobbying firms and more male dominated, and then went to another part of the country and was engaged in a women's issue, and he was surrounded by women leaders, and he called me after his first executive meeting and said, now I understand what you mean about the soundproof booth, that I'm sitting at the table and nobody could hear my idea until one of the women echoed it, and then suddenly everybody wanted to talk about it. I'm wondering if you have any experience of feeling that sort of the other side of inclusion being in PR and communications.
Yeah, I think despite the fact that we have a majority of women in the workforce at Edelman, I think we still grapple with the same issues that a lot of people do. You still need to encourage people to have a voice. And so we actually took a page from the public sector, took a page from the private, or the opposite, from, I believe, the Obama administration in Shine, and encouraging women to speak out and have someone amplify if that person wasn't heard, have another woman actually say, no, I don't know if you heard what Kathleen just said, that's an important point. We started to use that, and again, this was very informal, this was not a memo that went out to anyone. We just started to use that, and that changed the nature of it. But we were grappling with, I think, some of the same issues. I will tell you that I traveled quite a bit across our 14 offices, and there are some offices where there's still a male-dominating leadership culture, and you feel it, and you sense it. And we've taken, kind of commitment to each other at the leadership level to call that when we see it. So if there's a little bit of joking around and it's probably not making everyone comfortable, instead of sitting there and smiling and laughing, somebody might say something, politely, but we're really making an effort to do that because it's still happening, I think, in any company, in any office, anywhere.
Yeah.
I'll tell you something
Go
that
ahead.
surprised me when I was at the FCC and I was leading a global conference. The number of, first of all, that I was selected as a woman from the U.S. to lead it was amazing. And then the number of women that were involved from regulators across the globe, and the ease with which the men and the women would dialogue, even when we had language difficulties, was, I found, so much better than what I sometimes found here in the States, which surprised me. Although what it told me is that as women rise to the top in government, again, this was governments, women rise to the top in governments, there were a lot of women, there were a lot of men, but they had gotten very comfortable in this environment of pretty much equal percentages. And so I do believe, and historically I think you've seen this in the US and other countries, that public sector training, visibility, exposure can lead to opportunities, and you may have never been seen if you hadn't taken that leap over into the government opportunities.
I want to give everyone a chance to comment on any policies that you've implemented in your organizations or that you've seen that have really helped to support women in leadership.
Traditional slating has been important when we're looking at officer promotions. I'm looking to see a slate that is diverse, not just in gender, but I'm looking to see a slate that's diverse in ethnicity, and increasingly also I'm looking to, at corporate level positions, to see a slate that's diverse in country of origin. Because I'm finding an issue not germane to this group, but my Americans are winning too often since we're headquartered in the U.S.
Yeah.
For that, and I've got to think about how do I
Yeah.
stop that.
Yeah.
But slating is critical, and for any job above a certain level, I'm expecting my HR team to say, yeah, there's an appropriate array of candidates, and I think that forcing to make certain that all the voices are being seen and heard helps. I don't know that it changes what an ultimate outcome would be. I think it does, but for sure it changes the process of how we think about moving up and developing talent.
At our firm, I think flexibility, and I don't know if that's an actual policy, it's more of a mindset, but we were finding that women, especially women with families, young families, or of childbearing years, were not really comfortable moving. They didn't want to necessarily move for 3 years, to a different country or a different city. And so we took a hard look at that and said, does everyone really need to move for 3 years? Maybe 1 year is actually okay for certain roles in certain situations. And sure enough, more people start raising their hand when it's a little bit more of a flexible situation like that. So you can't do it for everyone. It can't be disruptive to the business, but there are places for the right talent. You could probably make it a little bit more of a flexible win-win for both, and that's something we've started to adopt more.
And at our company, about 6 months ago, we finally implemented, and I think it was long overdue, specific percentage requirements for diverse candidates, director and above. We hadn't done it in quite a while because the thought was, as long as we're recruiting, maybe we didn't need the numbers. But in fact, you need the numbers to really push. And what I found is once I embraced it, and I would say to folks, I can't believe you're not finding me candidates. And they're looking in all the traditional places. And so what this does is it forces people to, again, get out of their comfort zone, look deeper, and say, director and above, I need diverse candidates, and I'm not going to be satisfied with the same old, same old. And again, it will make your company will be stronger. You'll be bringing in people that are hungry, ambitious, and really want to succeed in the company.
So I'll kind of second that with maybe a little more granularity, and that is to suggest setting up the chessboard. This is a chess game, not a checkers game, and so it really means that you have to set up the moves to make the moves. As you look at your succession in your organization, you have a number of spots that are the prime development opportunities for the most senior leadership roles in the company. If you fill those all with, the majority, then you're not going to have the piece to play when it's time to play it. So you really have to look at what are the high performance areas and where are the high potential areas for development, and ensure that you have enough options of leadership in those high potential areas that you're not going to lose the slate that you're developing between the time that they hit the BU level and the top leadership level, because that's where things fall out. And it's not, and it doesn't fall out by a small amount, it falls out by like 50% or more. So it's a really critical element, I think. I don't know if you call that a policy. I think it's common sense, but it really does come from good governance. I mean, nobody argues that it's important, but how do you create it to be urgent and important? That's where I see, from a governance standpoint, things falling away, because every time you go to make these decisions, it feels like you have plenty of time, unless you create urgency and accountability around each of those moves.
Yeah, our numbers are flawed, right? We talk about how many senior officers are male and female, and I've started trying to be conscious about saying, of my 3 business units, 2 are led by women, because almost certainly it's going to be the BU leaders who are going to have the inside tracks, and I don't think we collectively, or the groups that monitor, pay attention to what types of senior officers are male and female, and I'm agreeing that
because it happens a move or two before you are making that selection, right?
And then the one other piece I'd add to it that I saw with Maggie at Frontier that was great. Not everyone in the senior team is going to come up to be the CEO. So her role, she felt, was to help our experiences and our expertise by helping us and encouraging us to be on a corporate board. And that's one of the challenges that I've seen when occasionally folks will come to me and they're looking for a board member, is that they'll say, well, the women I want are haven't yet retired from business. They're incredibly talented, but I can't get them on a board because their CEO is afraid that it will actually detract from their day job. In fact, the board that I went on, I think, greatly added value to the work that I do at Frontier. And so if you think the right way, I think that there is a way for CEOs to encourage their senior leaders, men and women, to expand and have that expertise so that not only are you feeding the CEO pipeline, you're feeding the board member pipeline.
Yeah.
You know, it's looking at the supply and the demand, and we all have agreement about the demand. So now how are we going to supply that demand? And these are all, you know, strategies that we're talking about that actually create the options that can then go into the boardroom, that can then go into major P&L roles. And there's a correlation, you know, it goes right from one to the next.
Yeah. I want to open it up for questions. I see we've had people chomping at the bit here, so.
Hi, my name is Julie Rothaus. I'm the CEO of Cinevoice, which is a company I founded last year. So I made myself the CEO. A comment and then a question. I noticed when this session started that about 50% of the men left the room, and or more, and now we are in the echo chamber of, you know, women talking to women. We get it, okay? So my question to you guys is, what are you guys doing to, you women doing to engage the men in the corporations to understand what we in this room already understand? Thanks.
I can talk to you a little bit about Frontier, and in fact, it's been interesting because Maggie Wilderwater was the CEO for a while, and now it's Dan McCarthy. I've actually spent a lot of time, probably more than he wants, with me telling him, you need to stay focused on this because of the comfort zone thing. I know people, they're already here, I'm comfortable with them, why don't I promote them up? But he listens. And I'm able to have that impact and that influence. But you know what? That takes a long time to build that kind of credibility. So do I do anything broader across the broader industry? I don't, but within my own company, I do. And certainly with the board that I'm on, it's a very diverse board, and I don't really need to push on that particular board, but I suspect others have had different experiences.
I nudge. I have no problem doing that if I see that there's an opportunity. With mostly at my peer set on the leadership team, if someone is talking over someone, if someone is taking credit for something, if someone is just not maybe thinking about the audience and the diversity, I have no problem saying that, again, usually quietly on the side, sometimes through a text in a meeting. I think you need to keep that conversation going. You need the credibility, you need the relationships to be able to do that. You can't do that with a stranger, but people, I find, tend to go, oh, I didn't realize I was doing that. It's not an anger response. It's usually a thanks for pointing that out to me.
And certainly in the tech industry, there's been a lot of conversation about women in tech. You know, my responsibility is in marketing, and so I've taken it to build the Women in Tech and the diversity program under my responsibility so that we could showcase mentors and showcase role models for other women. And also, it was definitely a very specific thing that we did to make sure that the keynote featured women IT leaders rather than just having a Women in Tech panel off to the side.
I'm loath to speak on this topic because I know it's hard ever to argue as a guy, you know, that you understand the female experience. It's hard to argue as a white you understand the African American experience. So I'm not doing that. But there are behaviors that I try to make certain that I reinforce. So when there is a misstep and one of my female officers will say to the male officer, hey, you know, I wasn't done yet, it is my job to say, let her finish. I mean, it's my job to at least when my female officers are speaking out against a behavior that I may or may not have noticed if they hadn't spoken out, just to continue down the prior path. It is my job as the senior officer to say, let her finish. It's a good point. I need to finish, and we need to finish hearing what she has to say, and so on. And that at least we can do. I don't think we can pretend as guys that we understand fully. We never will, that experience. But we can intervene.
And I think what's more important is that we understand that great business results and top talent is what's at stake. And I had a conversation several years ago with Bill Simon when he was CEO of Walmart in the Americas, and he said, Jane, it's the wrong conversation. The conversation is around top talent. The reality is that we now have over half of the population in business schools that are female. And so mathematically, if you look at the equation and you are not looking at 50% of the talent as being part of your decision-making process, you plain and simple are not hiring the best talent. So, irrelevant of man or woman or whatever else, that's something that we just have to face, that we have an obligation to, on behalf of shareholders in public companies, on behalf of the country, in the public sector, et cetera, to get the best people and the best jobs, and we can't release 50% of the talent for some silly reason.
Yeah.
I'll add one other thing that I did that I just thought of that was very strategic and came because of my experience in government about how you have to pull things together. There was an opportunity to nominate people for what we call SVP, which there's the people who report directly to the CEO and then right below them. And they're very few, they're very valuable. And everybody put forth names. I put forth only one name, one woman, and I called every senior leader before the interview process started and talked to them and basically got their buy-in that she was ready and she should get it. Nobody else did that, and only 2 people out of the entire company got the SVP slot. But I staged it because A, I took my best person, I didn't give 5 names, and then B, I followed through. So you do have to be strategic usually in companies because there's a lot of people competing for that shelf space.
But there's a lesson in that. So the lesson is that it wasn't the person grandstanding on behalf of themselves. So let's just go back to this conversation about men and women. And the men that are no longer in the room are the important advocates, because any time you're in a situation, the most eloquent spokesperson on behalf of you is someone else. And I think we have to get down to brass tacks of what really makes for the best results and create a positive peer pressure. Right? Let's, we need to elevate the game on behalf of all of us. And that's a different conversation to have than, help the poor women.
Yeah. I want to get to, there was a question here.
Hi, thank you, Joan Michelson. Full disclosure, I'm writing a book on this, so I know way too much. I'm also a woman, obviously, who's done this. 2 things. One is, if we call somebody out, even gently, something like that, then we get labeled as difficult to work with, or a problem, or a bitch, or pick your synonym. If a guy does it, it's clever. Okay, so we need to deal with that, and I'd be interested in your response. I'm glad you all have these programs, but all of the companies that are not in this room are the ones that really need to hear what you're talking about. But the more important thing is women take a different trajectory, okay? You sort of alluded to it with the public-private going back and forth, but we make different choices, right? We have values, different choices, and the problem is the criteria to advance someone is still stuck in the male-dominated career ladder methodology, and the applicant tracking systems and all of that matches the traditional male model, which I understand why it exists because men created it for men. But in order to really make the difference of what you're talking about and not have that fallout, Jane, we need to look at these careers differently and say, what does qualified really look like? and have the HR people and the ATS systems reflect that change. And how do we do that? That's a culture shift, and that's a system shift.
You mentioned something about HR, and I'm fortunate I have HR reporting to me. And one of the things that allows is for us to look at exactly what you're talking about. What does qualified look like? What are the assessment criteria that we're considering? And I can't tell you how many people fell through the cracks. These are really qualified people, women, people of color, people of just different kind of backgrounds that might not look like a top talent, but they were and they are. So you need to be able to have access to that, and you need to be able to make sure that there's people involved that see the mission the same way that you do, and they're hearing it from all different parts. And the only other thing I'll mention, just because you raised it, the labeling. After a while, if everyone starts calling out behavior that's probably not appropriate, the labeling goes away. That's what I've seen, and that's what a lot of my colleagues and coworkers and friends in different industries have seen. But it can't just be one person, because that's the problem. If that becomes the peer set, that changes the game.
Oh, yeah, there's a mic behind you.
Hi, thanks. Paula Stern, I think this has been a great discussion. I'm a member of CED and have been for a long time, and called myself chairwoman, not CEO, in my consulting. And I learned to get your PhD early on, because it does really save some time along the way. So that was a perfect comment. And I want to comment on the public-private points, which were all brilliant, and relate it also particularly to Amazon, because while we in our work here at CED over the years have been trying to show why bringing women in and increasing diversity enhances the financial performance of a company, we also believe that it enhances the technological outcome of new innovation. I've been working for years with the National Center for Women and Information Technology, NCWIT, and have found that when there are diverse teams, they come out with, if you will, patents that are cited far more. So it's much richer, much more important, much more fundamental. But on the public-private, we've also on the technical question, and I think we should talk about technical companies a lot more, though of course I respect every industry and the outcomes. But the numbers are so much worse when it comes, as you said, in the technical field. The role of male advocacy is incredibly important. Calling out which is biases, conscious and unconscious bias goes from one industry to the next. But particularly in the technological area, in the tech area, we found that women are retained and stay in the public sector in tech far more than in the private sector. And they're not leaving tech. They're just going into the public sector and doing tech for a lot of reasons having to do with the public sector culture, which you touched on, but also having to do with the fact that they're given leadership roles far more in the public sector in tech. Finally, I just wanted to say something about sponsorship versus mentorship. Your example is perfect on what sponsorship makes that difference. You made that phone call. You expended your own, if you will, political capital within the organization to go to bat for somebody, and that's hugely different from mentorship.
Yeah.
So I know there's a lot of comments and not any questions, but I really wanted to get the tech piece into the discussion.
On that topic of the tech piece, part of the argument that we were able to make to build a program to build the pipeline of talent, which is, by the way, we're reaching all the way to K-12 because, girls decide I'm not interested in technology in middle school. But part of what we were seeing is we have 3,000 open positions in software development across the company. And same as what you said, if you're only looking at half the population or less, then there's no way you're going to fill those jobs. You're not going to find that top talent that you need. And so it was purely, really a practical matter of the numbers of talented people that we needed in the company, and we had to fully engage the population. I think we are out of time. Is that right? I think we're out of time. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you all, panelists, and a round of applause, please.
We're going to take a 15-minute break, be back here at 4:15 sharp, and we'll start our next panel discussion. Thank you.